And welcome back, students. Today we are continuing our journey on class definitions. We are going to be discussing in further depth methods. So recall, as mentioned previously, there are two kinds of method actions. Those that return a value and those that perform an action. So for example, print line of the system.out is a method that performs an action rather than returning a value. In this case, the action it does is write to the screen. If we look at nextInt of the scanner class, this is a method that will return a value that is typed by the user. So the user, types, let's say, 23 on the keyboard, then it returns 23 to the program. Now, if you recall, there are methods that use void. These are methods that perform an action rather than return a value. We haven't really talked about the return value ones much, but we will today. Now, there's some slight differences in the construction of these two methods. And while both methods are similar, they bear slightly different construction parameters. So a void method generally will follow this pattern. Public void, method name, followed by a parameter list in the parentheses. You have to have the parentheses, even if there's nothing in there. Method that returns a value is usually going to be something like public, type returned, method name, parameter list. And when I'm talking about type return, that means whether it's an int, a boolean, a string, that's where you're going to define what that is. Now later in the chapter, we will examine when to replace public with a much more strict modifier, and that it's possible also to add additional modifiers, but we're going to start with these for now. Additionally, our first examples that we're going to look at will have an empty parameter list. In other words, we're not going to require the user to have anything in the parameter list. We're just going to leave those empty for now. Returning values. If a method can return a value, it must be the same type as what the method is defined. So, for example, here I have public double my method. With that right there, if we look, the type is double. So therefore, it would return an answer that is double. We look at the second one, public string your method. The type there is string. So I'm going to expect that it's going to return a string. And of our last one here, public void our method, if you look at that one, it's going to return no value because it has the keyword void. Now the keyword void is used in place of a type and roughly means that we have no returned type. So really, if you think about it, void is really the type returned, and we're just kind of plugging that in for type return. But at the same time, void it's a keyword that just means that there's nothing going to be returned. So no return type. Now invocation. An invocation of a method that returns a value can be used in an expression any place that a value of the type returned can be used. So like for example, an object is an object with methods having our sample heading. In this case, the following are legal. So here I have double D is equal to onObject.myMethod. And I also have string, a string variable is equal to an object.yourMethod. And the reason for that is because if we look back, we have public double my method. In that, what was my method? It was a double type. If we look at your method, it is a string type. When we look at the objects that we constructed here, with our invocation of those, my method was a double, and therefore D has to be a double type. If I had done that as int D equals an object.myMethod, we could have ran into some errors. I mean, it might do some type conversion, but you're generally going to have an error because there's a type mismatch. You're trying to change it from one format to another. Similarly, if we look at the second one, that was a string type in our method construction, and therefore this a string variable should also be a string type. Now, a void does not return a value. As we've mentioned numerous times, void method has no value being returned, but will simply perform an action. Therefore, when we look at method invocation with a void method, it's merely a statement. So, for example, an object.ourMethod. So that's why you have like string.length. Kind of thing. Now, parameter list. So far, we have avoided the topic of parameter lists by only giving examples that require empty lists. Now, please note that parentheses are required even when we have an empty parameter list. Like I mentioned earlier, you have to have the parentheses there at the end of your method name. You can't just create a method and forget the parentheses. You have to have them. Now, we will discuss parameter lists later on in the chapter. Now, let's look at these methods a little bit more in depth. We have kind of looked at methods before when we looked at a right output method, but let's look at this one. The body of a void method definition is simply a list of declarations and statements enclosed in a pair of curly brackets. So in this example, I have public void our method, and in here it simply says this is not a hello, this is not a print line from our method. So it's a real simple method. Now we look at the body of a return method. It's the same as the body of a void method, but with one additional requirement. The body of a return method of a method returns value must contain at least one return statement. So we have to return an expression. All right, that's the key way of how you would do it. So return an expression, whatever it's going to be. So let's look at that as with an example. In this example, that would be public string your method. Scanner keyboard equals new scanner system.in. System not the print line, enter line text. String result equals keyboard.next line. Nothing new there, but in the next line is where that return expression exists. Return result plus quote was entered. Right, so right here, this last line is this right here. Now notice these are two different points, so these are two different pieces. This is all one block of code here. This is unrelated to this. This is our generic. This is a concrete example. Now note, a method that returns a value can do other things besides returning the value. But style rules dictate that whatever the method does should be related to the value returned. So in this case, if we look, this was returning result, which is what they entered. And so we had also was entered on the end, just to kind of give the user a little bit of feedback. Now, using return in a void method. If you want to end a void method before it runs out of statements, you can use a return statement without any expression. So let's say you have 5 lines of code, and about 3 lines in, you're like, well, I actually just kind of want to end this. Maybe I have an if-else statement or something there. You can just use return without any expression after. A void method does not need to have a return statement. Right? So it's not a requirement. But you can place a return statement in a void method if there's situations that require the method to end before all the code is executed. So, the example just gave you have an if-else statement. If a condition is true, you're like, oh, I want this not to continue on to the next line of code and do whatever I'm going to have it do. So you just stick the return statement in there, and what that does, it exits that method. All right, we reached our self-test question at this time. Before I branch this off, though, I just want to bring up the date second try method here, which you will also find in your notes. So this is, again, taking that date first try that we looked at before, and we also have in here date second try. And the thing that you'll notice in here is that we have a couple more things going on here. So we have some new methods. So here's a right output method that we saw before, but we also have a void method here called read input. We also have a couple return types. So you can see there's public int get day, public int get year, and public int get month. And you can notice that with get day and get year, they're pretty easy just to come back because this is just an int returning an int. But when we look at get month, notice that it's of type int, but then we have to do these if else's down here simply because when we type in the month, we're starting that off as a string. So in order for us to convert that over, we have to use these if-else statements. And of course, make sure you also have an else down here to act as your catch-all, because otherwise you're going to run into issues. Especially make sure you also have this right here, return 0, which is what you need to put in here to keep the compiler happy. Now when we look at the demo for date second try, in here you can see that we have date second try date equals new date second try. So this is just the object being constructed. Here I am invoking the read input method. And then down here, I am using int day number because it's day.getDay. So here is another invocation of the getDay method. And then I am right here just outputting day number, which I created right here into my code. And that concludes our notes, folks. Until next time.